Prenatal testing for a wide range of disorders and impairments has become increasingly part of routine prenatal care. We do genetic tests for disorders such as Tay-Sachs. We do blood tests and amniocentesis for chromosomal disorders such as Down syndrome and others. And there are other conditions for which we're increasingly doing testing. Typically, as it happens, when prospective parents receive a poor result, a positive result for any of these tests, they tend to abort the pregnancy. That's more or less what has become routine in the context of prenatal care. In addition to prenatal testing, and similarly, we're increasingly seeing pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, where we create a set of embryos using in vitro fertilization and then choose one embryo that doesn't have a disorder or an impairment that we're trying to avoid, and we implant it. So that's another way in which we can control whether children are born with various disabilities and impairments. Now, prenatal testing, and in particular the routinization of prenatal testing, raises a wide range of ethical and social issues that are worth thinking through. In this section, we're going to talk about some of these issues, and we're going to do that particularly through the lens of disability theory. We want to ask questions like, when should these tests be made available, who should have access to them, and when are they ethical to use? Now, there's a clear and powerful argument in favor of making such tests available, and that's an argument from reproductive autonomy. Over and over again, as a society and in our courts, we have reaffirmed the idea that people have a very strong right to control their own reproductive narrative. That is, to be the ones who decide when, whether, and how to have children and create a family. And so insofar as prenatal tests give prospective parents more control over their reproductive narratives, there's a very strong presumptive argument in favor of access to these technologies. However, there are also a wide range of considerations on the other side and ethical complications that go along with these technologies. Now, there are a range of positions we might take and questions we might ask about access to prenatal testing. For example, we might ask just straightforwardly, is it acceptable for a particular test to be offered or for a particular test to be taken? Especially when, as I pointed out earlier, the realistic outcome of a positive result is going to be abortion. And we might ask, well, for what conditions is this acceptable? What counts as enough of a disability or an impairment to warrant making testing an option for parents? You might ask something even stronger. You might ask, not is it acceptable to make the test available, but is it ever the case that the test ought to be mandatory? Or perhaps somewhat weaker than that, you might ask, do prospective parents ever have an actual duty or obligation to test for a particular condition and perhaps to abort if a positive test comes back? There are people who defend that strong view. They see taking the test as part of responsible parenting, part of protecting the health of a child who's going to be born. But notice that you can't use prenatal testing and abortion to actually protect the health of a fetus. The fetus is either going to be born with the impairment or the disorder, or it's not going to exist at all. And this raises what bioethicists typically call the paradox of harm, which in a nutshell is the point that you can't harm a non-existent being. If you bring a person into existence, even if that person has a disability, then as long as existing is better than not existing at all, as long as their condition isn't so terrible that they would be better off never having been born, you can't possibly be doing a harm to them by allowing them to exist with that disability, since the only other option is non-existence. Now, there are some conditions like Tay-Sachs, which is completely uncurable and results in a very young, very, very painful death, where you might in fact argue that existence is simply worse than non-existence. But most of the things that we use prenatal tests to test for, like Down syndrome, it's just not plausible that the people who are born with that condition would be better off not existing at all. So the idea that we owe it to our future child to use such prenatal tests as part of responsible parenting or protecting that child's health really doesn't stand up under scrutiny. That does leave open the question, though, when are these tests acceptable and when are they not acceptable, even if they're not obligatory?